Iberê, is it possible to travel to another continent by car? Is there a bridge that connects each continent? Or is there a longer route? Kisses from Yasmin. Yasmin, the answer to that question is much cooler than you think. Stay until the end. Iberê, why are rivers here in Brazil and in other places usually brown or similar shades, but in places like Switzerland they're perfectly blue? First of all, let's take a look at a Swiss lake to see what you're talking about. This is it. It's water that looks like it's been dyed. And that's pretty much what happens in practice. Switzerland is in the Alps, which is a group of mountains there. It's in Europe. They're very tall mountains covered in snow. There are several glaciers there. A glacier is a gigantic mass of ice that melts over millions of years. It goes down the mountain, and as that happens, the rocks underneath get ground up. This glacier crushes the rocks as it goes down the mountain. This ends up creating a fine powder, a dust, which people call rock flour. And as you might have guessed, at some point this glacier will reach a lake, the ice will melt, and the rock flour will go along with it. Since it's such a fine light powder, it ends up staying suspended in the water, right? So that water you see in Switzerland, it's not completely transparent, it's kind of opaque. Take a good look at the pictures and you'll see. And what's even more interesting is that this rock powder absorbs the colors that are closest to violet in the rainbow. But at the same time, water absorbs the colors that are closest to red. So thinking about the rainbow, it's as if you cancel out the colors that are very close to violet and cancel out the colors that are very close to red. So in the end, when the light enters the water, it reflects off those particles, the things that are at the bottom and so on. And the only thing that manages to come out is the blue light and a little bit of green light. And you know that when we mix green with blue, we end up creating a turquoise shade, which is actually pretty similar to the one in the biology book from Manuel do Mundo, right? It's a greenish blue that's really beautiful. But I sensed a bit of sadness in your question, right? Man, in Brazil, we don't have rivers as beautiful as the ones in Switzerland. I don't think we have that Swiss blue, but man, in Brazil, there are endless beautiful rivers. To start with, even the names are beautiful. There's a city in Mato Grosso do Sul called Bonito. Because it's really beautiful, the rivers there are just amazing, the water is extremely clear, and it's not that dirty blue with mountain gunk, it's a real blue from the water itself, sometimes greenish, bluish. You can dive in, see the fish, go into underwater caves. Brazil also has some really beautiful watercolors near the sea in the region between São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. There's a place called Costa Verde, which includes Ubatuba, Paraty, and Angra dos Reis. That's where we did our first scuba dive, where we put the Manuel do Mundo submarine in the water. In that place, the water is emerald green. And we still have a lot of meeting of the waters in the Amazon. The most famous of all is the meeting of the Solimões River with the Negro River. We've already made a video there too, where the muddy waters of the Solimões meet the black waters of the Negro River. And that division between the waters continues for hundreds of kilometers. So in the end, Switzerland is beautiful, but we've got a lot of great water around here too, come on. Hi Iberê, my name is Rodrigo, and I wanted to know, when we travel internationally and buy things, souvenirs, or even food in another country, what happens to our tax money? Well, since we're foreigners, we don't pay taxes in another country. Yeah, Rodrigo, it's not quite like that, not exactly, that's not how it works, you know? Taxes aren't a simple thing where you pay one tax and that's the only tax there is. In Brazil, for example, we have income tax, which is a tax on your salary on how much you earn. The more you earn, the more income tax you pay. But you also have, the Imposto sobre a Propriedade de Veículos Automotores, which is a tax on motor vehicles. When you have a car, you pay a tax because you own the car. And then there's also the Imposto sobre Produtos Industrializados, the Imposto sobre Circulação de Mercadorias e Serviços, the Imposto sobre Serviços, several different taxes that are applied in different ways, depending on what you buy, the service you purchase, how much you earn, and so on. When you travel to another country and buy something, there is a tax. Yes, you pay that tax just like anyone else. But wouldn't that be unfair? You travel to Italy, you're not an Italian citizen, and you still have to pay taxes in Italy. Kind of. Again, because once you set foot in Italy, who pays for the Italian police taxes? And they're the ones protecting you there. When you walk down a street in Italy, who pays for the repairs on that street? Taxes. So, in the end, it's not exactly wrong for a foreigner to pay taxes because they're using a number of services that are paid for by taxes. But still, there are some countries where, when you buy certain things, when you're about to leave, you can show those items, show the receipt, etc. and get a discount, get some money back because you're taking what you bought to another country. Not every country has this. When countries do have it, it works differently. Anyway, there's no standard way. This is the one real bill. It was used from 1994 until 2005 when the central bank decided to stop making it and replace it with a coin. It had two problems. The first was that it was a bill of very low value, so it was used too much. People had stacks of 1 real bills and so on. That caused the bill to wear out a lot. A bill had an average lifespan of about 13 months. If you were around at that time, you'll remember that sometimes there was tape stuck on them and the bill would get all worn out. And then the central bank has to collect them to destroy and print new bills to replace them because you can't have all worn out money circulating around. The second reason is that those bills were heavily counterfeited. You might say, hey, but is a coin really safer than a bill? I don't know. What I do know is that with the 1 real bill, nobody would hold it up to the light to check if it was real or fake. You'd get a stack of 10 low-value bills and you wouldn't bother checking them. So in the end, it's much more practical and much safer to have a coin that will last 20 or 30 years and doesn't need to be replaced. It's easier to carry in your pocket and all that. But there's something really interesting, and I'm going to tell you a story. I have a Polish friend who lived with me in the same apartment when we were in college. He went back to Poland, and once he came to visit Brazil in Rio de Janeiro as part of an official Polish delegation and everything. And I made a quick trip to Rio de Janeiro just to have a conversation with him since he was only going to stay in Brazil for a few days. And we went to have a beer by the sea in Ipanema in Rio de Janeiro. Some people showed up playing music, and usually they play, and then when they're done, people give them a tip and all that, and he pulled 5 1 real bills out of his pocket. And when he gave it to the guys, they didn't accept it. They said, no, that bill isn't worth anything anymore, I don't want it, and so on. When he lived in Brazil, those bills were in circulation. He kept those bills and came here and tried to spend them like everything was fine. And actually, everything was fine. The guys from the band just didn't understand. When a bill stops being produced, it doesn't mean it's not worth anything anymore. It's still valid, and you can buy things with that 1 real bill today. The shopkeeper, the bank, they have to accept it. It's a bill that's still valid. It's just not produced anymore, but it still has value just like normal. Several real bills have changed their style, changed their design and everything, but they're still valid. It's all good. But there's something way dumber than that, which those guys from the band did. A 1 real bill, if it's well preserved, can be worth up to 40 reais to a collector on Mercado Livre on the internet. So, when this Polish friend of mine gave 5 1 real bills to those guys, he was actually giving them a tip of about 150 reais, and they refused it because they don't watch Manual do Mundo. If the time machine was invented in the future, why hasn't anyone come back to tell us? Yeah, if the time machine was invented in the future and nobody came back to tell us, it probably wasn't invented. How does the bee make honey? I mean, the final step, because my son asked if it was bee poop. It's not bee poop, but maybe it's worse than that. Let me tell you. Bees go around landing from flower to collect something called nectar, which is basically just sugary water, really just water with sugar that you find in flowers. They have this exactly to attract the bees, because when the bee arrives, it ends up pollinating the flower, it brings together the male and female parts of the flower, and the flower gets fertilized, it will turn into a fruit. When the bee gets to the flower and collects the nectar, it drinks this nectar, and the nectar is stored inside a special part of the bee called the honey sac, which is like a temporary stomach for the bee. There, the bee already starts releasing some enzymes. It already begins to turn the water with sugar into honey. But then it flies back to its home, to the colony, where it meets with several other bees. And do you know what it does? It regurgitates the honey into the mouths of other bees. It's like a kiss on the mouth that passes the bee's vomit from one to another, except it's not vomit, it's nectar that's turning into honey. This process can happen a few times, and the bees also regurgitate and drink that nectar again, and this keeps drying out the honey. The nectar turns into honey and loses water, getting thicker and thicker until it finally becomes real honey. And that's when the bee stores it. Depending on the bee species, the little container is different. So Mari raised some Brazilian bees that actually stored honey in little pots inside the nest, and there were very few pots, sometimes just 3 or 4. In the Africanized bee, the one that stings, the one with the striped butt, they store honey in hexagonal pots. And we have that honeycomb pattern, which is really beautiful with those closed pots. When you cut it, when you run a knife over it, the honey flows beautifully. But why does honey exist after all? Wasn't it enough for the bee to just drink the nectar from the plant and be fed? That could be, but honey is a food reserve. So the bees go collecting nectar during the time when there are lots of flowers. Because then the cold comes, there's a time when there are no flowers and the bee won't have anything to eat. Another advantage is that honey doesn't spoil. If the bee stored just nectar, it would probably get moldy or have some other problem. You don't keep honey in the fridge. You can leave it in a jar for a long time and it won't spoil. And that's what happens inside the bee's nest. Why is the penguin a bird but it can't fly? Yeah, so you're creating an obligation for birds that isn't really their thing. There are plenty of birds that don't fly. The biggest bird of all, the ostrich, lives in Africa. Hey, it doesn't fly. In Brazil, we have a kind of mini ostrich, which is the rhea, and it also doesn't fly. Its Australian version, which is the cassowary, also doesn't fly. And in New Zealand, we have that cute little bird, which is the kiwi, and it also doesn't fly. In short, just because it's a bird doesn't mean it has to fly. They might even have wings and all, but there are many birds that don't fly. These are just a few examples. But speaking of that little creature over there, look how cool, silly question. Said that the question is silly, it's because the question is good. Just take the bee out of there and the silly question becomes a good one. Because I love this kind of question. Did the word kiwi come from the fruit or from the bird? Kiwi is a Chinese fruit, but the name was given in New Zealand. And there they call it kiwi fruit. And from that you already have a clue. If it's called kiwi fruit, it's because you need to say it's a fruit. In the beginning, when they started growing kiwi there, it didn't have that name. They called it Chinese gooseberry, which means something like Chinese currant, because somehow it resembled the currant fruit. Then, in the 1950s, a company that produced kiwi. There must have been some really smart marketing guy. She said, man, this fruit looks like the bird. Let's start calling the fruit by the bird's name. Because the kiwi was already called kiwi, right? The bird. Then they started calling the fruit kiwi, and it became really popular. The fruit ended up being known all over the world as kiwi, which is the name of the bird. So the fruit is called kiwi because of the kiwi bird. Mayday is a term used on the radio, both in airplanes and in the Navy. When there's an emergency, it's a call for help. If it were in Portuguese, it would be something like help, help, help. But Mayday is an international code. You say Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. People who speak other languages will understand that you're in danger, that you need help, and they'll stop everything to help you. And the way you write it is Mayday altogether, like it's Mayday. Did something happen in May? Do more plane or ship accidents happen in May? It has nothing to do with May. It's an expression that comes from French. It was created in 1920. In French, one way to say help me is m'aider. Let me even write down the expression here. Help me. No, in this case, that's actually in Portuguese. Let's see it in French. Mayday. It's written just like you're seeing here. I know the way it's written doesn't have much to do with the way it's spoken, but it's French. And just like we have trouble speaking French here, the foreigners who created this expression, who spoke English, also twisted it a bit and it ended up becoming Mayday, not Maider. But the idea was to create an expression that was very easy to understand in any language, easy to say and all that. And to this day, it's still Mayday. If we put all the people side by side holding hands, how far would it go? At the moment I'm recording this video, the world has 8,223,282,125 people. To simplify things, let's assume that each inhabitant of planet Earth, when they open their arms to hold hands, takes up the space of 1 meter, which is about this much. Putting all the people together, it would make a distance of 8 million kilometers. Okay, but is that far or close? Can you get to the United States with that? Did you notice that I chose this question just so I could use the globe, right? If there's no globe in this video, it's not an Iberê Answers. Let's go. Here we have the equator line. It's about 40,000 kilometers long, rounding up. These people holding hands could go around the Earth many times. Just so you have an idea, the distance from Earth to the Moon is 384,000 kilometers, but we're talking about 8 million. You could go to the Moon and back several times, but the party ended here too. Besides the Moon, the closest celestial body to Earth, the one that can get closest to Earth, is Venus. It's not always close, okay? Because the planets orbit the Sun at different speeds. So sometimes Venus is on our side and sometimes it's all the way on the other side of the Sun. But at the moment it has to be really close, at a distance of 38 million kilometers. So we have two conclusions. The first is that the Moon is a really close neighbor when we think about space. And the second is that there are a lot of people. Is French Guiana part of France? Yes, it is part of France. That land has belonged to France since 1667. It was a colony of France, just like Brazil was a colony of Portugal. But today it's no longer a colony, it's actually a French state, and that's very different. When a place is a colony, it's in a bad situation compared to the metropolis, right? Compared to the owner of that colony. For example, if a person is born in a colony, they can't be considered a citizen of the country of the metropolis. Usually they don't vote for president, governor, or senator for that country of the metropolis. In other words, those born in the colony end up being second-class citizens. They're people who have fewer rights than others. It was like that for a long time in French Guiana, but not anymore. Those born there are French citizens, they can vote in French elections, retire with a French pension, and the currency used there is the euro, and it's part of the European Union. It's very similar to what happens between Hawaii and the United States. Those born in Hawaii are regular American citizens. But there's a really crazy fact about this. What is the longest border that France shares with another country? It's not with Germany or Spain, it's with Brazil. If you look at the map of French Guiana, there's a huge border there with Amapá, and that's the longest border that France shares with another country. What is the highest point in Brazil in relation to sea level? I can only think of Christ the Redeemer. It's pretty high, but it's far from being the highest. We get the impression that it's really tall because those things are so close to each other, right? The Corcovado mountain, which is where Christ the Redeemer is located, is 704 meters tall. Christ is another 38 meters. So if you go up there, you'll be at 742 meters high. But height is different from altitude. Height is the distance between the top of something and the ground. Altitude is the distance between the top of something and sea level. In the case of Christ the Redeemer, both things coincide because you can see the sea from up there at Christ the Redeemer, and that's why it gives this amazing impression of height. And the highest mountains in the world are usually not by the sea, so you can't see such a great distance. But they are way above 700 meters from sea level. The highest mountain in Brazil is in the Amazon. It's Pico da Neblina, located in the state of Amazonas, right on the border with Venezuela. It's 2,995 meters above sea level, but you can't see the sea from there, not even if cows fly. Can you tell me where platforms like YouTube, TikTok, etc. get so much money to pay people? YouTube and TikTok pay people because before the video, sometimes in the middle of the video, an ad appears. So if you want to advertise on YouTube, should you want to promote your company or something you do, you'll have to pay. Part of that money goes to YouTube, to the platform, but part of that money goes to the people whose videos showed that ad. So if an ad appeared while you were watching this video here, we might have earned a little bit of money. That's how it works. But let's go to Yasmin's question, which is whether we can travel to another continent by car. And for that, I'm going to have to draw the world map on the board. Let's start the controversy here. Continents are something we invented. If you look up what a continent is, you'll find something like it's a large landmass that's treated as a single entity that has similar characteristics or something like that, which doesn't really help us much. Here in Brazil, we usually divide it into 6 parts. America, Africa, Europe, Asia, Oceania, and Antarctica. But right away, you notice something strange. How come Europe and Asia aren't just one big piece of land? Yes, it's a single piece of land. There's a division here which is the Ural Mountains, then the Ural River, some inland seas, and then they split apart for cultural reasons. But Europe and Asia are actually a single landmass, which is even called Eurasia, the combination of both. There's also a controversy here, which is that we call this Oceania, but in other places it's called the continent of Australia. Because the other islands there, like New Zealand, Indonesia, and so on, are considered part of the continent, even though they're islands that are separate. But at the same time, if we don't consider these islands as part of the continent, wouldn't that mean Japan wouldn't be part of Asia? Or that Cuba here wouldn't be part of America? Speaking of America, over in the United States, they make a subdivision of South America and North America. There's no Central America. For them, Central America is part of North America. And more than that, we split America here with the Panama Canal. They became 2 different continents. But there's something much worse than that, which is rarely talked about. It's that Africa and Eurasia, they're together, they're connected by land. There's a little umbilical cord here in Egypt, about 200 kilometers wide, that connects these 2 pieces of land, and we also cut it to let ships pass. It's the Suez Canal. But there's something else interesting. The cut that was made here and the cut that was made here are completely different. In the Suez Canal, it's really a tear, a hole in the ground that simply connects the two oceans. Thinking about the whole world, it's a connection from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean passing through the Mediterranean here. The Panama Canal is quite different. It's a very mountainous region where you couldn't just make a cut and join one ocean to the other. Here, there's a lake on top of the mountain. And for the ship to go from one side to the other, it goes up a kind of river with locks, crosses the lake, and goes down the other side with locks again. One ocean isn't connected to the other. All this to say, Yasmin, that this continent thing is kind of complicated, but let's answer your question. Imagine you're in Brazil. So there's a highway that starts here in Ushuaia, which is the southernmost tip of South America, and it goes all the way up to Alaska, but it's just an imaginary highway. Actually, it's a combination of several highways that we end up calling the Pan American Highway or Pan American Route. It crosses the Panama Canal just fine because there's a bridge here at the Panama Canal, but to the south, at the border between Panama and Colombia, there's a serious problem. There's a region there called the Darien Gap that doesn't have a highway, it's dense forest. And there we have indigenous nations, heavy drug trafficking, and hundreds of millions of people wanting to cross to get through Central America and reach the United States. So if you leave Brazil by car to go to Alaska, when you get here, you won't be able to get through because there's simply no road. What people do is take some kind of boat, a ferry, put the car in a container and so on. But these are very complicated operations. It can get very expensive, or if it's a bit cheaper, it's very dangerous. You have to bend the rules a bit to get from South America to Central America or to North America, depending on your point of view. When you get here in Alaska, there's also no land passage from America to this tip of Asia. After all, we're talking about a round world, right? This part connects to this one through the Bering Strait. Here it is. Look, one piece of land is really close to the other near the North Pole, but it's not that close. It's about 80 kilometers at the closest point. But there's no bridge, and it doesn't freeze completely enough for you to drive across. We know that humans crossed here in the past, but that was at a time when the sea level was lower and you could cross by land. So Yasmin, because of the Darien Gap and the Bering Strait, we can't leave the Americas by car, and it's pretty much impossible to travel between continents by car, with one exception. I'm not going to count between Europe and Asia, because that's too easy, okay? There are plenty of roads here, and I consider it just one continent. But if you're in Europe and want to go to Africa, you can actually go by land. The Suez Canal is narrow. It's made for ships to pass through. Ships aren't that huge, so it's about 200 meters wide. It's the equivalent of a big river, but not a Brazilian river. A big river over there in Europe, because the rivers here in Brazil, in the Amazon, are much wider than 200 meters. So here, there are not only bridges that go over the Suez Canal, but there are even tunnels that go under the Suez Canal. That means then that when we solve the problem at the Darien Gap and the Bering Strait, you'll be able to leave here from Brazil, take the Pan American route, go all the way up through the Americas, cross over, travel through Asia, take a trip in Europe, and go all the way to South Africa. All by car.